boyfriend or girlfriend? You know someone like that? You smell a trap. So you might be sitting around the table with that person this weekend for Thanksgiving, and their unfortunate partner or spouse. I do. I have a very close friend who we're all kind of looking at her and her partner and thinking, what are you thinking? What is wrong with you? Can you not see how awful this person is? How can you not get this? We're hoping that sooner rather than later she comes to her senses and gives him the heave-ho. But in the meantime, we are loving and patient and tolerant, and our tongues are bleeding. So the people of Israel are kind of like that person who has really bad taste in a partner. When they choose their kings, when they choose their leaders, they make terrible decisions. And in fact, God knows that this is how it's going to go. God knows this is their tendency to choose tyrants to lead them instead of to choose God to be their leader, to be their king. The prophets over and over and over again say, God wants to be your ruler. God wants to be your number one. God wants to be your boyfriend. And you want to choose this other miserable tyrant instead. And it's not going to go well for you. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be ugly. And you're going to be sorry one of these days. This is the constant refrain of the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. When the people say, give us a king to rule over us, the prophets say, be careful about that. That's going to be tricky. That's going to be hard for you. And don't forget about God. Don't let this king lead you away from the person who you should have true allegiance and devotion and love for, which is the one who led you out of Egypt, the one who sustained you in the wilderness, the one who loves you as a mother. Don't forget about that primary relationship while you're chasing after these kings, these tyrants, who you think are going to make everything better for you. They're not. That's kind of where I go when I think about this feast of Christ the King. This is the feast that we celebrate every year, the last Sunday in the season after Pentecost, the Sunday before Advent begins. We get the feast of Christ the King, which is, in case you can't tell, not my favorite celebration. It's actually a relatively new feast. It's only in the last couple hundred years that the church has even marked. It was set up by a 19th century pope. And it was designed to remind the rulers of Europe at the time that they should be they should be subservient to the lordship, the kingship of Christ in their own leadership, in their own ministry as potentates. So it had a dubious and ulterior motive in being established in the first place. So we are given this feast of Christ the King to celebrate this Sunday. And the context, I'm trying to build you this context for how we might approach the idea of Christ the King. No. I love technology so much. It's on again, but let's see, does it stay on? Yeah. And the gospel helps us as well. It seems like a weird lesson, doesn't it? If we're supposed to be thinking about Christ the King. With many crowns. I think I need to do that. We get this lesson of Jesus before Pilate. And they're having a conversation about kingship, but he's really clear. My kingdom is not from this world. I'm not a king in the terms that you're thinking about kings. I can't do that. So Jesus, like the prophets of old, constantly rejected the idea of being made a king. Several times in the gospel it says that they tried to sort of grab him and take him and make him their king or their leader or their military commander. And he rejected that. He said no. He said, that's not who I am. That's not what I'm about. So he's very much in line with the prophets of old in rejecting this notion of political, earthly, temporal power. What he chooses is very different. The throne that Christ sits upon in his glory is the cross. And the crown that he receives is of thorns. So how do we continue as a church to talk about Christ the King in terms of the golden throne and the kingly trappings? We know that that's not where Jesus was. That's not where God calls us to be. That's not how we are supposed to engage with our faith or with the world. It's not going to go well for us if we try to put Christ in that position as temporal, earthly king. He rejected that position, and we're called not to that kind of power, but to humility, to it's important